Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is Sick Talks number 69. I'm here with Tricia Romano, who I haven't seen in a long time, Tricia, but who is an old friend from our nightlife days, and more specifically, and more apropos for today's conversation, her editorship of at the Village Voice, where she was nightlife editor. And so we met kind of in passing around parties that I threw and things that we were both out with and dances. Wow. I just called the parties we went to as adult dances. That was weird. but, but anyway, I have teenage kids now, Trisha. So consequently, I'm constantly thinking about everything through a high school lens. How are you? What's been going on?
I'm pretty good. I've been in, it seems like nonstop interviews for the book.
Yeah, this is for your book, which you can see over Trisha's shoulder. It's called "The Freaks Came Out to Write." Excellent Houdini joke, by the way. And
thank Greg Tate for that. Do you remember Greg Tate? He was
I do, of course.
he was the music writer at The Voice. He died a few years ago, and during a brainstorming session on a Facebook post when I was first pitching the book idea, he came up with that. I was like, okay, you're just an amazing genius. I mean, like, just casually coming up with a great pun.
Well, I mean, the flair for culturally appropriate referential language, I think, is something that I certainly recall from so much of the Voice's writing anyway. And so, yeah, apropos. So, okay, so I'm gonna say back to you, because full disclosure, I have not read the book yet. I've got a copy coming to me, but I haven't dug into it yet.
Nope.
What?
I said, oh.
oh yeah, exactly. It's my mea culpa, but I want to be forthright about it, and also, like oral, without exaggeration, oral histories are my favorite things to read. So I'm really looking forward to digging into
it.
Really? Oh yeah. I love that. I mean, I love oral histories, but the book is an oral history of the Village Voice, starting from its founding in the 1950s through to its eventual end, which has happened in what, the early mid-aughts?
I mean, it's still technically around.
Ah, okay. Well, forgive me for saying that then.
It stopped printing in 2018 and went online only, and then the last owner shut it down in, I think, like 2020. And then, oh, is that right? No, I think it stopped totally in 2018. And then a new guy bought it, and now it's kind of a little bit alive. I mean, it's got a website, and it publishes some stuff also from the LA Weekly, and because they own that too, and they do publish some new things. They did a review of my book, so it exists, but it's not, obviously not the powerhouse it was before.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of that, it's funny. We met when I first, or roughly around the time that I first came to New York in the late 90s. I was working in the music business, and so I started to see you out at parties and shows and dances, as I said earlier. Anyway, I came to New York having contributed as a writer to both the Philadelphia City Paper and to the Philadelphia Weekly. And so free weeklies were really like an incredible currency for me. They were a way that I kept in touch with everything. They were the way that I charted my weeks. I planned my nights out.
Yep.
The Village Voice, the New York Press, I never missed copies of those. And then there was lots of other free media. We now live in a world where almost none of those things exist anymore. And I wonder to what extent, going back and looking at the 70 years of history, was a rumination on, like, could something like that, could conditions like that ever exist again?
I mean, that's like the big question, and I don't know, because this generation is so digital, and I mean, I actually find it frustrating because, like, if I actually want to go do something outside of my house, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Like, what's the Facebook? Is that how I find out? Like, it's like You know what I mean? Like, there's not like
Yeah,
we used to even have in the early days of the blog era, like there was like, what was it called? Candy something. And there was like
Mm,
a list, like they would send out, it was almost like
yeah,
a newsletter. They would send out a list in New York this week to
sure.
do.
This is how Brooklyn Vegan started, for instance.
Yeah, same thing. And like now I'm not even sure there's like not one place that kind of aggregates all of that. And that was like one of the things that the Voice was really valuable for, was like that big stack of listings that they had in the middle of the paper. We
Yeah,
had all those like movies and, concerts coming up, write-ups, everything. And, Time
yeah,
Out also was one of those things that, that started
yep.
to bite into the Voice because they could be even more comprehensive. Um, and they were paid. But even now, I don't think, is Time Out a thing? Like, does anybody like
Timeout is, yeah. I mean, well, but and that's it, right? It's like timeout is still a thing. But if you asked my daughter, who just ran up the stairs, she would
Mhm.
not be aware of it, right? I haven't seen it, or I've interacted with some digital content, and I do a lot of online reading, and maybe once in the last year or so. So yeah, it is a bit mysterious as to like where all of this stuff, you
Mhm.
know, dissipated away to.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think, how does your daughter find out about what's going on?
Well,
Like, if she wants to
it's
go to a
interesting.
bench. How old is she?
She's 14.
She's 14. So she's not quite like where she can go clubbing or anything, but
No.
there's probably all ages stuff that she wants to go see, right? Like, how does she find out about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the obvious channels. Of course, it's her, her friends communicating with her on Snap. It's to some degree Instagram. It's to some degree YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Where the sort of word of these things filters out. But it is not. It isn't centralized, and it isn't. I think your note about things being comprehensive is
Mm-hmm.
certainly true. It's like it's. I think it's really easy for people, fans of a genre or a culture, to go deep there. But the
Mm-hmm.
idea of reading broadly, as I think you and I probably
Mm-hmm.
were learned to do, or were trained to do, or whatever the
Yeah.
case is, by the availability of all that stuff, is just doesn't feel like it's as
Well,
present, which I
I mean,
worry about
that's
a little bit.
yeah. I mean,
Because
that's like the thing about print, right? You hold it in your hands, you flip through it. Stuff that you didn't realize was happening is like on that page. You might not have seen it if it was like in digital. You might not ever come across that link unless the
right,
algorithm let you. And you start reading about stuff that you wouldn't normally read about. You're seeing stuff. You're scanning the page. Headlines that you didn't know you were interested in. You're reading like the first
yeah,
couple paragraphs. Like, you just pick up more in a print thing.
right, through
And
osmosis almost, yeah.
yeah, and I actually, I thought like the iPad would, um, or any kind of tablet, you could get that experience somehow, but so few places do like a mimicking or a PDF version of
Right,
the
right.
magazine. Very few. And I
Well,
always enjoy it when they do. I think the New Yorker does it maybe, but
yeah, I mean, there's that app Flipboard that does that, and a few others. But I mean, I think it's like having had one side of my life being in the let's call it culture creation, nightclub DJing, nightclub
mhm,
promoting, that sort of stuff world, and my other side of it in selling ads and coming up with marketing campaigns and that kind of stuff. It I look at that iPad surface area and I go, yeah, that isn't a place for discovery. That's a place for me to put a bigger ad and
mhm,
drown everything else out. So
mhm,
you lose the serendipity and the osmosis of that kind of multi-format
mhm.
space and the ability to spend time with it. Well, geez. Okay, so then the implication there then is that you've written the oral history of this thing that kind of can't be replicated again, or will never be replicated again. How does, I mean, I don't know, like as not only the author, but also as a contributor and an important part of that ecosystem in its creation, like how did that make you feel?
I mean, I think it's pretty depressing, right?
Mm,
It's one of the reasons why I really wanted to do the book, because I felt like we had to record it, Like we really had to record what this thing was and how special it was and how influential it was and how different it was. And I don't know, like maybe there's some time in the future when all the kids that are growing up just no longer want to look at a screen and they just go like hardcore into analog again. And like maybe they'll want to do something like that. But the other thing about The Voice is that it was really dependent on New York being a vital and exciting cultural and political center. And, I can't speak as much to that now. You could probably speak to that more than me. But is it anymore? What is it? Like, what's New York like compared to when we were there, 20 years ago? Like,
no, I mean, it's funny. It's like on the one hand, I was talking to a friend of mine who, shout out Trevor Sims, or former colleague of mine for a long time. And you probably, I mean, Trevor managed Andrew WK. He was part of the New York hardcore scene way back in the day, founded Noisy, the music channel at Vice. So anyway, Trevor and I were just catching up this morning, and he was talking about how now that he's in LA, like you can't walk out of your house and feel the electricity.
Energy.
That is certainly still present. And I think it's a question of where you look for the pockets otherwise. Like I tell people all the time, like I've been in Greenpoint for 25 years. When I tell people now that I live in Greenpoint, they're like, "Oh, that's cool. That's fancy. That's whatever." And I'm just like, it was the end of the earth, the literal end of the earth when I moved in here, right? Like very, very different.
Compliment.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I guess it's all to say, like everything's relative. Time changes. I watched the documentary about the artist and documentarian Clayton Patterson a couple of weeks ago, who is he's one of these figures, like diehard figures of the Lower East Side, and captured very famously the riots in Tompkins Square Park.
Okay.
Great documentary made in 07, 08, and was the Lower East Side really at the point of inflection at that, where, the institutions started to disappear and the condos started to go up. And looking back at it nostalgically, I was like, yeah, I miss the wildness of those days. And on the other hand, I remember the first time I ever went to Max Fish, or the first time I ever went to the Hat, El Sombrero, and just being terrified, like just feeling like incredibly unsafe, and just going like, yeah, I don't need that anymore,
Well, but there's a funny, there's a chapter about Tompkins Square Park riots in the book, and there's a quote from Lenny Kaye, who's a guitarist in Patti Smith's band, and he talks about that. He's like, Tompkins Square Park and that whole area around it was bombed out. Like people don't realize how bombed out it was. It was abandoned buildings. It was like Polish slumlords and like people like, living in there, like squatting, this whole squatter thing. And, I think crack was big. So there was like crack around like on the sidewalk and, and, on the one hand, it was like very free and, pure anarchy and lots of creativity happening. On the other hand, like, you had to look over your shoulder. And Lenny Kaye was talking about that. He was like, hard to, I have a 2-year-old or I have a daughter and I, do I really want to like, it's hard to romanticize that time, even though. So it's like, I think like with any amount of gentrification in any city, I always feel like it's kind of like a tipping point where it gets like annoying or like cloying, where it's like you want a little of the like nice new better grocery store whatever and like a big affordable, but once it starts to go to where everything is like has two, staple and fancy, two names, and like is like some adorable like yuppie thing. You know what I mean? Like once it goes there, you just don't want to be there anymore. It's not what it doesn't have any of the original energy.
Yeah, it's funny. I think you sort of you said a word, free, right? It felt free, and you want to preserve that feeling of freedom. And I said a word, safe, which you want to feel safe, right? And I don't mean safe in a coddled, like overly protected way. I mean simply like I can go here, exist, and not be harmed.
Yeah. Yeah. Like it's like you need that balance. And I don't know, once, condos are going for 3 million, then you lose any of the edge. And
well, it's funny though. I wonder to what extent, and I think part of the loss in not having a media center point like The Voice was, is that it could serve as an arbiter of the good and the bad. It sort of it allows, and in the title of your book says it, right? It celebrates the freaks in a way that makes them at the very least understandable, if not approachable, if not palatable, if not admirable, but at least understandable. And by the same token, it demonstrates there has to be an order to things. There has to be some level of cohesion, or else, I don't know what. Well, that's not a fully formed thought, but it's like there's kind of nothing makes sense.
That's okay.
Yeah. Well, so I wasn't exaggerating when I said that oral histories are my favorite literary form. I'm a huge fan of interviews.
Which one do you love? Do you know off the top of your head?
I mean, oral histories, for instance.
Yeah.
Well, like off the top of my head, and I mean, like Legs McNeil, Please Kill Me, of course, is a really important one.
Yeah.
Oh,
he
yeah, for sure.
That with Gillian. Yeah.
And the one, so ostensibly this conversation is a tracking the stories that I highlight in the newsletter. One of the stories in the newsletter this week is how toupees are the new flex for men. That I just put that one in this morning, so you haven't seen that one, but it's in the Rob Report.
What is it called?
Toupees.
Hair pieces. Oh, I saw that on TikTok.
Yeah. So that was written. That story in the Rob Report was written by a guy named John Ortved, who is a friend, and John wrote an oral history of The Simpsons, which is another amazing one that comes immediately to mind. And then obviously there are zillions of examples in magazine journalism, which I just love. Vanity Fair always does a good job with those things, and I just like the truth is not monolithic, right?
Right.
No one person's experience is true in a totally objective sense, and oral histories do a good job, I think, of telling that. But I guess what I wonder about the book is like you spent, or you're chronicling close to 70 years of history, contribution, import, etc. Like, how do you pick and choose? Where do you start? Like, who's the sort of the core that launched you into this endeavor?
How did I start? Well, I started because of the reunion that we had in 2017, and I saw how many of the elders were so, they're in the 80s and 90s, and I thought, well, they're going to disappear soon if we don't catch their voices. They were firsthand witnesses, to this amazing thing, especially way before I was there, obviously. And then, when I was putting it together, there are certain things that are really obvious you have to hit on, It's sort of like I made the analogy to someone else about like a Bruce Springsteen concert or something, or like any big long band that had been around a long time. There are certain hits that you have to play or people are going to get mad. Right. And then there are the things that like people who are on the inside get and know and will be mad if you don't cover. And then there's like the super obscure things that you should shine a light on.
Right,
You know what I
become your
mean?
pull quotes. Yeah,
Yeah,
of course.
it's so it's like, there was like Wayne Barrett and Donald Trump. Like that's something you have to cover. It is important, it's relevant to now, and it
Yeah,
is a perfect example of how like The Voice was writing about somebody nobody was paying attention to way, way, way before and like had his number in 1978 or 79, whenever he
right.
published that. And then, then there were other things like, Nine Hancock, like the First Amendment writer. And you have to write about Nat Hancock. He's like,
Yeah,
he was there the longest and he's incredible. But he's been written about quite a bit. So then you want to be like, well, who hasn't really been written about in this like tech context? And it's like somebody like Greg Tate, who
sure.
sadly, after he died, is when everyone was like, oh yeah, he was like probably one of the most important Black writers to
Right.
come out in the last 30 years, 40 years. And so, you fixate, you build something around him and like the part of the world that he was part of. And then there's like some big hits in The Voice's history and stories, like the Kieran Finley cover story. So you start to kind of gather things around those um, people or story ideas. And then, as you're talking to people, certain things start to add up and certain things kind of reveal themselves.
Yeah.
And then you also
Well,
like, I also looked at like what were big events in New York history. And so, a good example of that is like Central Park 5 and,
sure.
um, you know, the Tompkins Square riots. And then you think, okay, let's find the voice story to that.
Yeah. What were there ones that jumped out at you as being particularly surprising? Like, I don't know. One of my New York City touchstones is LCD Sound System's "Losing My Edge,"
Mm-hmm.
because I remember very specifically the moment in which I heard it in the offices of the Fader magazine. Eddie Brandon played it for me. Two, because it was my reintroduction back in New York after being out of town for a year living in Australia. But three, because James in the song is so precise about the moments when it happened, the rooms in which it happened. And I wonder, it has helped me frame my life in lots of ways where I think about like, oh, this is the moment that something changed, or this is the
Mm-hmm.
place in which something, an epoch began. Were there any of those that jumped out at you that you hadn't been aware of that were, I don't know what, illuminatory?
You mean just in The Voice's history?
Well, or even just in New York City history, right? Like yeah. I mean, it's like
No,
that.
I mean,
Yeah, go
no,
ahead.
I kind of like knew like the general arc of like New York going from the 60s into the 70s, and, the 70s being so bombed out, and then, the resurrection of it under and Koch and like, um, and then, Giuliani's attempt to clean it up. Like I knew like kind of the general flow of those things. Um, and in terms of the paper, I didn't know very much about the early days at all. Like I knew vaguely that Rupert Murdoch owned it, but I didn't know
Wow,
like
really?
how his
I didn't know that.
he owned it for like
Was that like a transitory period?
it was like from the late 70s to early 80s, mid
Wow.
80s, and then Leonard Stern, another billionaire, bought it, and he but I didn't realize because the other books that are about the voice one they both end before he comes in essentially, and that means that there was really nothing written about it until I was like interviewing people and finding out that like he was actually a very good owner, and strangely not like as difficult as you might seem, except if you were the editor in chief he was a pain in the ass, but to the staff they had no idea, right? But he didn't ever change it because he knew it was going to make him money. Do you need to, are you okay?
No, sorry, I've just got a bunch of background noise in here in the
I
house
can't hear
that
anything.
I'm trying to minimize. Okay, good. Well, I'm going on off of mute, so hopefully you can't. But that's good. That's our Steve Jobsian technology isolating my audio. Well, so I guess then, asked a different way. Then, what was like a favorite story that came out of the recording process?
Of the what?
Of the well, I say recording because I assume that you're sort of recording this. I don't know. I just transpose my own experience into everything. So I presume that you must have done the book just like this, right? Just talking.
Yeah, I mean both in I did in person, I did on the phone and Zoom. So yeah. Favorite moment or story? Oh my God. I would say like I loved talking to Richard Goldstein about his unbelievable life in the 60s as a rock critic and writing his popism column, and he'd be like, yeah, the Velvet Underground played my wedding. And I'd be like, what?
Yeah.
Like the third story I ever wrote was covering the Rolling Stones on a yacht. And
Oh my God. That's so funny.
I mean, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
What is your life?
Well, it's so fun. I mean, apropos of that, James Murphy observation or that story, or the idea of being in the room when it happens. Like, I was I am on the advisory board of the John and Alice Coltrane home, which is out in Dix Hills in Long Island. It's the home where the Coltranes moved to get out of the city, and where Alice recorded a bunch of her records and John wrote a Love Supreme.
Mm-hmm.
As a function of that, I've been paying a lot of attention to jazz clubs and that sort of stuff. And I had lunch with a friend the other day who is going to open a new jazz club in New York. And we were talking about that. I went to an event at Birdland in, the theater district. And the thing that strikes you about those places is that they are small. They seat 150, 200 people or whatever it is. And you think about like the incredible cultural contribution of, jazz musicians, for instance, really truly impacting such a small number of people that without an organ like the Voice as a for instance, to magnify that, you really run the risk of that thing kind of like never existing. Yeah, of kind of never existing in the first place in most people's imagination. And that's really, it was a weird thing to try to get my head around.
There's a quote in the book from Amy Taubin where she's quoting Jonas Mekas, the avant-garde film writer.
The filmmaker, sure.
And he says, we are writing about things for history. That's his quote, which is,
right.
We are here to document this for history, because basically if we don't do it, who is?
So that's kind of, I mean, on the one hand, it's bleak because, especially in the media climate of the last 10 years, we haven't been doing things for history. We've been doing things for the clicks or for the
I was
lulz.
just going to say.
Yeah, I mean, since we've been doing it for clicks or for lulz or for page views or whatever it is, right? Like the whole
virality.
Yeah, the hierarchy of reason was sort of flipped, right? If you think of it through that lens. But then beyond that, it's like we oh man, now I lost my train of thought. This happens to me.
I know it happens to me. Old age, I was going to say.
Oh no, now I remember. But okay. But go ahead. What were you going to say first, and then I'll come back with the question because I have it now.
Wait, now did I forget? I think I forgot. God. Damn it.
Well,
no,
first of all, we're not old. We're not old. Say it many times. We're not old.
I was going to say the thing that is also terrible about the internet is that some owner will put the thing out of business and just pull the plug on the entire thing, and you will never see any of her work. Like what just happened to Vice, right? Like all these writers are like, I can't even save a PDF of my work. Like it's it's like it never happened.
Yeah, I think some of that was probably a little exaggerated in Vice's case in particular, and of course the great work that people like the Wayback Machine do to help document stuff. It's funny actually. I was talking to Trevor about it this morning. Somebody in the wake of that whole Vice meltdown sent me a link to the 2002 article about Vice in the New York Press, in which the infamous article. And
before the New York Times one, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes, before the New York Times one, and much more damning if you want to think of it in that way.
Yeah.
But so these things do exist. But yeah, I think the idea that right, the owner can come along and just turn off the servers is scary. But this was what I was going to ask you, and that I lost for a second, was like you were in service when at the paper, and it's not to diminish your role at all, but in service of probably some of the more ephemeral things that the Voice, was covering, right? You were Nightlife editor. You were thinking about moments in time. You were thinking about like the most micro of scenes probably at that time, some of which blew up and became huge things. LCD Sound System is a good example, and some of which refuse 15:15 Thursday nights, Wednesday nights at the Slipper Room, faded into the background.
They were fun. They were fun. We had a good time.
We did.
What was the Dominic's Plant Bar? There was another one.
Oh wow, yeah. It's funny. I had lunch with Dom during the pandemic a little bit, and I guess this is the thing. It's like we all learn from those literal ephemeral moments. But when you talked about, Jonas Meek is talking about writing for history. It must have been an interesting. You must have, as you think back about that, been an interesting contrast, because like you were writing for Wednesday night.
Yeah.
In a lot of respects, whereas maybe somebody else is writing for history.
I didn't think of it as I also never imagined that we would not be able to find this stuff in the future. You know what I mean? Like we were still printing, and I always saw it as like my job to make sure that like the underground subcultures that we were a part of got airtime, because they weren't going to get a lot of time anywhere else. And so I felt like that was my, role, is to make sure that got recorded. But I didn't think about it like for the future, you know what I mean? Like, I just thought of it as like, somebody's got to cover these people. Like no one else is going to do it. We're not that many people out there doing it. And to just document it.
I think both because right, and also because of the consistency, the weekly consistency of the Voice on Wednesdays, and then also because of the breadth of the market. Like you were able to shine a light on things that at a scale almost that nobody else could manage, because it's like I did a lot of the same stuff as a contributing writer in Philadelphia, but we had 1/10 the number of things happening, right?
Well,
the Syracuse New Times, where I grew up, had 1/10 of that, right? So it's like you were a kind of a giant among those voices.
Well, that's just a product of being in New York too. Like one of the things I realized when, because I was in Seattle, and we had 2 weeklies, we had the Rocket, we had a lot of like alt media, but like for New Yorkers or for the rest of the world, like Seattle just barely existed, except for like it being like grunge central. But I was part of the DJ stuff, and like no one knew that we had like kind of an incredible club scene here, like very, very active, very vital. All of the big European DJs were coming through here, like when they weren't going to other places, and there were several local DJs that I thought were unbelievable, and no one had ever heard of them. And then I got to New York, and I realized that some of the DJs that I had read about were, and and it was, but I knew their name but I knew their names and I knew their faces because Paper Magazine wrote about them, The Voice wrote about
Sure.
them. They just had the opportunity, the advantage of being in New York City, and that was
Sure.
like the mouthpiece for the entire country and the world at the time, media wise. And I thought, like, well, if I just take a couple of my hometown DJs and move them to New York, they would be fucking famous in 3 seconds. But no one is going to care about
Right.
this little edge of the earth, in New York media. And that's
That's
like
so
also
funny.
that's like a New York arrogance too, like.
Yeah.
Where
There's, like tremendous, New York privilege. It's funny, actually. David Marks tweeted something yesterday. He wrote Status and Culture last year and the book Amatora about Japanese fashion a few years ago. And he was an editor at Tokion back in the day, when you and I first got to know each other. But anyway, David tweeted something about Paris Hilton apparently talked about learning to DJ and how hard she had worked at DJing and several of the DJ skills or the DJ techniques that she invented. And his tweet was essentially like, what techniques did Paris Hilton invent? It was obviously a rhetorical question, not meant to have an answer, because it doesn't have an answer, except maybe none.
Mm-hmm.
But I just like that sense of like, of course I invented that stuff. Like that's a very sort of New York thing.
If it didn't happen here, it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
If the tree didn't fall in New York City, did it even make a sound? Like that's basically the village, the whole New York media way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, so to that end, I want to get your read on something a little different, which is, so I didn't ever anticipate raising kids in New York City, but I have. So I have got these 2 New York City kids, and my son is going to go to college in the fall, and if I were in his shoes, I would be looking for the next bigger thing, whatever that is. What else is? I mean, where do you get a sense of the most exciting stuff coming from now? Like that, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but it's like that energy of New York. It never dies, but maybe it moves elsewhere. Do you get a sense that it has like gone anyplace else?
I have no idea. I mean, you hear about Berlin for a while, and then you hear about Lisbon, you hear about Mexico City, Barcelona, maybe. Like, they're not here in the United States. And I think, for a while it was Portland, and now Portland's expensive, and no opportunities, to work. So, I think the issue is for art and creativity to flourish is you need it to be affordable. And I think every mid-sized city is now as expensive in rent as some of the big-sized cities, and without the opportunities that New York or Seattle or San Francisco offer. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of this stuff pop up over in Berlin and Lisbon and whatnot, because, especially in the 2000s when we were running around, like all the people that were moving to Berlin, like they were living in huge lofts with for like $400 or euros.
Yeah, for sure.
You don't have to work to make that. Like, and that's fantastic. Like, I don't want to work. Who wants to work? Like,
I mean,
like,
not if we can be just paid to think.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, he was, they had a freedom. And so like, instead of going to some corporate job or whatever, or doing something they hate every day just to eat, they were able to create music or art and like actually maybe even sell some of that or tour and DJ and make records and make enough money to live on that, because the cost of living is low enough. And you just don't have that here in New York, especially. You see on TikTok, can we see your apartment? How much do you pay? It's like a $5,000 OnlyFans chick, come on.
I mean, first and foremost, those are all engineered. Nobody is actually just getting stopped on the street. It's like we're going to see people for a reason. But no, look, I take your point, and it's interesting. I'm a student of, and I'm fascinated by the flow of that kind of cultural energy. And also, as somebody obviously who's worked on the commercial side of things for a long time, I'm also like, I hear you on things needing to be affordable and things needing to be a particular way for true creativity to flourish. But there is always the economic reality. And one of the things you told me that I just, blew my mind was that Rupert Murdoch owned the Village Voice.
Mm-hmm.
Rupert Murdoch, I mean, like, yes, he's buying influence. Yes, he's buying, presence. Mm-hmm. But that guy's buying money, right? The Voice, it was a business at some point. And not to say it wasn't always a business. It was mm-hmm. always a business, but it would have been a serious business and one that goes against a little bit of that kind of bohemian, ideal
for sure.
We just talked about. So to what extent does that come into the story of the paper?
Somebody said the Voice was a victim of its own success.
Interesting. Okay.
Because the founders did not start it to become media moguls. I mean, certainly they wanted to make some money, but right. They didn't really make any until they ended up selling part of their shares to Carter Burden, who is Carter Burden, who is a business city councilman and a man about town. He was married to Amanda Burden, and they're like socialites.
Hi, I've got somebody visiting the house. I'm actually Marcella.
Sorry, it's okay.
No, it's okay.
We can start over.
True podcast. Yeah, I'm going to actually stop this for a second. Hang on just 1 second.
Okay.
All right, now we're back. Yeah.
What were we talking about? I forgot.
Oh, who knows? Yeah, whatever. We'll get into the rest of it. Well, so Tricia, what I'm interested to know. In our last sort of few minutes together, what are you up to now besides the book? You talked earlier about getting a story into your editor, and I just don't know what your minute to minute is these days.
Well, I barely have a minute to minute. Really, I'm really just doing the book promotion right now.
Oh, cool.
I have an event in Seattle tomorrow, and I have an event in Portland next week, and I'm doing interviews like every single day. And it's great because the reception has been great, and I've worked a really long time for it. But I need to start making money. I don't know how I'm going to do that. So the story that I'm working on for the Washington Post is not book related. It's kind of funny. It's going to be a good story. I hope it goes wild. But
all right. Well, I mean, make sure to send it to me so I can put it in the newsletter whenever it's ready, because I will be very happy to do that. And I mean, just to sort of conclude, speaking of the book having been very well reviewed, I'm just going to read. This is from the New York Times piece from last month, February 12th. It says it is a well-made disco ball of a book, big, discursive, ardent, intellectual, and flecked with gossip. It may be the best history of a journalistic enterprise I've ever read, in that its garrulous tone so mirrors the institution's own. So, I mean, I'm going to tattoo. I don't know how much you paid for that review, but like,
I'm going to just tattoo it all over my body, the whole thing. Just like, it's like incredible. Wow. I mean, you're like, I was like. At a certain point, I was getting really nervous because we weren't getting any press, and I didn't know if anybody was going to cover it. I was like, "Where are all the media people that love this thing, love the Voice?" And then, like at least half of the New York Times, it seemed like, was requesting copies, but
Oh,
we
that's
heard
awesome.
nothing, like we were like,
Oh,
what are we gonna,
interesting.
we were like, are we gonna do anything? And then like Friday before that review went live, we got a request for photographs. And then we were like, and there were a lot of photographs, and I was like, oh, that means it might be large. Oh, and then I'm in Seattle, so I'm behind all the East Coasters.
Right.
And that morning, I'm like waking up, and there's like my whole phone has blown up, and I'm like, what is going on? And like before coffee, barely able to see, like reading this and going,
Yeah.
this is real.
Wow.
It's
That's
like,
so cool.
I mean, it wasn't just a positive review. It was, it's the most complimentary review you could possibly even. I
Yeah.
couldn't write it a better
It's really,
review myself.
it's stellar. Well, and beyond that too, it's like I reached out. I had heard about the book, you know, and obviously I was taking note of it because of the voice. I was taking note of it because of you, and our old friendship. But it was Olivia Lang writing about it in the FT that caused me to reach out in the first place.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just
Financial
like
Times too.
this
Yeah.
is like this is a serious writer covering this. You know what I mean? And which is not to cast aspersions on anybody else who covered it, but just like, Olivia Lang, you'd presume, isn't just like picking up whatever somebody throws at her and chucking down a few hundred words. Like, she's really thinking about it. And so that was, I was really impressed by that. And so I think it probably speaks
I mean,
highly to the book.
Yeah, I mean, this book is just catnip for media, because media loves media more than anything, and
Of course,
media loves the voice, and the voice writers are all dispersed everywhere in media. So it's like I've got a mafia out there, Village Voice Mafia.
we sometimes
me.
we sometimes refer to the Vice diaspora, but I don't think there's nobody's really trying to protect that right now, which is a sort of is what it is.
Little different. Yeah.
We'll see, in 50 years time, whether it's judged differently, but in any case. Well, listen, Tricia, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and a wonderful roller coaster of like chaos and noise in New York City interrupting and all of this sort of stuff. So I'm so pleased to catch back up and to do so in this forum. Thank you for spending the time with me.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Well, listen, everybody, go get The Freaks Came Out to Write. Follow me. I will be writing about it as I read it, more in the newsletter, so you'll be able to follow it there. But in any case, Tricia Romano, thanks for joining us rather. And looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Awesome.